teaching nonviolent atonement. I'm Suzanne Ross.
And I am Adam Erickson.
And we're here today with James Alison. And we'll be introducing you momentarily, James. At Teaching Nonviolent Atonement, we use mimetic theory to upend violent theories of salvation and atonement. Mimetic theory is an anthropological theory of human violence, and it reveals that what we see at the cross can be explained in human terms. If we look at the cross and see evidence of God's violence there, it's possible we're getting things a little backwards. It's humans who have habitually scapegoated innocent victims in order to keep and maintain peace in our communities. That is what we call violent atonement, and it's what we do.
So we call our site Teaching Nonviolent Atonement because we believe scriptures reveal a God who reconciles humanity through enduring our violence, even unto death. Rather than inflict divine violence on his Son, God suffers our violence and forgives us for it. So each week, we have been having these chats as we try to work out the implications of this shift in atonement thinking with theologians, psychologists, practitioners, various other people. And today we are fortunate to have with us one of our best friends here at Teaching Nonviolent Atonement, frequent guest, James Alison. James, thank you so much for being with us yet again.
My pleasure.
Excellent. This is usually the time when we would do calendar and upcoming shows, but we're not going to do that today, are we, Suzanne?
No, we're not, because this is actually a moment of momentous transition for Teaching Nonviolent Atonement. It's our last event as a premium site on Patheos. Beginning May 1st, we'll be transitioning. We'll still be on Patheos, but we will be a free blog site. So everything we do will be open and accessible to everybody who wants to join us. So we're very excited by that. We're hoping to continue with our blogging, what Adam and I have been doing at Raven, and continue to expand it on the Teaching Nonviolent Atonement site, and then possibly have videos and occasional chats. We'll see what emerges with that. But we hope that everyone who's been joining us for these video chats will continue to be part of our community as we become a free blog on Patheos.
Well, that's very exciting. Awesome.
Yes, it is.
And before we move there, we have an excellent opportunity to talk with James Alison about, James, your book, The Joy of Being Wrong. And if you want to throw that book up there, that would be awesome.
I'll see if I can get it in. Yes, there we are. I can see a copy of it.
I love it.
He doesn't have any Post-its on his, I have on mine, but...
It's all in James's head, so he doesn't need Post-its.
No.
There's the Brazilian edition.
Oh, nice.
Oh, excellent.
As if we had trouble, as if we couldn't understand it already. Now we can read it.
And there's the French. There's the French, which was backed by Raven Foundation.
Oh, oui, very nice. Suzanne, do you want to do a little introduction for James before we get into our chat?
Oh, sure. James, how does one introduce you? He is Catholic priest, theologian, itinerant teacher and preacher, retreat leader, one of the foremost developers of the theological implications of mimetic theory, the author of numerous books and collections of essays, and most recently, the author of the new adult curriculum, or curriculum for adults, Jesus the Forgiving Victim, Listening for the Unheard Voice, which we produced together, Raven and James. So, wow. So what else can we say?
I don't know. Let's just get into this conversation because it's going to be awesome. James, we have had multiple people tell us that the joy of being wrong was a life changer for them. So on behalf of everybody here, I just want to thank you for this excellent book, writing it, and we're just so grateful that we can have this conversation with you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It was quite a challenge writing it in deep what's the word, deep Bolivia 20 years ago, and I'm exceedingly surprised and very glad that it's still alive and well 20 years later.
That's awesome. Great. Well, I want to ask you about the title of the book, The Joy of Being Wrong, Original Sin Through Easter Eyes. I must tell you, James, that I have never experienced joy when I've been wrong. And when somebody has proven me wrong, I experience negative joy. So, what do you mean by this title, The Joy of Being Wrong?
The huge relief that comes when you don't have to be right.
All right. I like that. Say more about that.
being able to let go, getting everything right the whole time, thinking, oh, I got that wrong, and guess what? It doesn't really matter. It actually sets me free to inhabit a bigger space.
What is that space?
I guess it's a space of being created, and therefore taking part in an adventure that's not, how do you say, closed down by, I don't know, one's intellectual sense of how things should be, things like that. You're able to discover that reality is bigger than what you were frightened it might not be, as it were.
Yeah.
James, I know you also talk a lot about having to be not just right, but good, and how we often spend so much energy trying to control what other people think about us, and it does tie us up in knots, I guess, and close us down in a way. Is that kind of what you're getting?
Yes, that's right. I think that the how do I want to say this? The search for being good is a terrible burden. In a sense, what I was attempting to do here was to undo some of the bad psychology behind some understandings of justification by faith alone, to enable a possibility of it to be understood, but what actually justification by faith through grace might mean. In other words, it's because we're loved, not because we get things right. And that's really, in one sense, all it's about. I mean, it's no accident that at the time of the Council of Trent, the twin doctrines, so that we're talking about the mid-16th century, the twin doctrines of original sin and justification by faith were seen to go absolutely together. What you thought of one was how you interpreted the other. How you interpreted the other was what you thought of one. And I think that that's absolutely right. So in a sense, what I was trying to do here is undo bad pictures of both so as enable a healthy picture of both to come together. How we find ourselves on the inside of something, which is us receiving something, which opens us up to something to which we don't have natural access. In fact, which we resist. We resist being brought into being. How we are let go of this resistance and enabled to be created. Sorry,
I like that
was probably a tediously pompous answer. Excuse me.
Well, I
better have some coffee to recover from that one.
Great. I like it a lot because whenever I talk to my progressive friends about original sin, it's basically viewed as a doctrine, as an ancient doctrine that should stay in the 4th century. And I assume, I try to tell them it's because they have what you're referring to, I think, as like a bad view of it. Can you unpack that?
Let's say that ever since the term original sin was what's the word, coined, which I think was by St. Augustine, it's been very, very difficult, as St. Augustine himself said, to put a finger on exactly what it meant. And it's tended to become linked in our time, or at least in the last couple of centuries, with an infinite and rather tedious discussion about primitive paleontology and Adam and Eve and things like that. Which I really don't think that's what it's saying at all. I think that it, to put it in a nutshell, it's saying, in the case of humans, our access to being created is through being forgiven. That's all.
Wow. Yeah.
Now, if you turn that round the other way, you see, so in order for forgiveness to come before creation, then you're talking about some sort of need for forgiveness at the time of creation. Logical deduction, well, let's call that original sin. But that usually therefore means, so we can now go back and start trying to examine what this what this fall was. Whereas in fact, it's something much simpler. What we have learnt and know to be true since Jesus rose in our midst is that our access to being created is available to us through forgiveness. That's it. I mean, it really is no more than that. But if you try to flesh that out, you will end up with something very like the doctrine of original sin. If you say, we're created anyhow, and forgiveness is something that comes later, well, then you end up with a moralistic account of who we are and a moralistic account of goodness and badness. So my sense is that the doctrine of original sin, the purpose of the doctrine of original sin, is actually to try and maintain the primacy of grace in our understanding of creation. That's all.
So, James, is it deliberate that you don't say being forgiven is prior to being recreated?
Well, yes, I think so. I think that because that leaves one stuck with notions of a first creation and a second creation as being two quite separate events. Whereas I think one of the things which I'm really very keen on is the notion that because Jesus is the creator and we are chosen from before the foundation of the world in him, we're talking about a single act which may show up in our lives in different stages. But organically, there's an organic content to it. In other words, who we will be in the new creation is organically linked with who we were created to be. So that's why I try to avoid too much use of old creation, new creation, because it plays into, if you like, strong dichotomies rather than distinctions within a single process.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
That is very helpful. Still, of course, hard to wrap one's mind around.
Yes. Well, that is certainly the case.
but you're pointing to some ongoing process of creation that we're involved in, and that and I really like your point that we're not that there's not this old and new, that the new is in opposition to the old or has to overcome or in some way defeat the old, because that's sort of the tendency, and maybe it falls into this sense where, and also when I've been born again, that becomes a one-time act that doesn't seem to be connected to some ongoing process. And so maybe that
ties in. I think that's right. I think it ties into the sense often found in language of born again of trying to find a particular area in which I lived badly before that I can then define and indicate where I've moved on. And that's usually to sell ourselves too short, because often it is actually, our so-called badness from which we're converted is more often than not our weakness. And very often our weakness is comparatively toxic part of our life, and very often the thing which we most need converting from is our apparent strength. So I can't hear you anymore. I don't know quite why.
Because we're not talking, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I love that distinction you just made between weakness and badness, and that our problem is usually our strength. That blows my mind. I love it. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Can I just add a point to what we were saying with Suzanne there? I think that the really exciting thing about this is not so much about creation, it's about the creator. The whole of this is to do with the utter aliveness of God and what it means for us to find ourselves discovering and being discovered by the utter aliveness of God. And in that sense, the distinctions which we hold on to, we have to be very careful that those distinctions don't separate us from what is, after all, a journey of us being taken into life. And that's what it's really all about. It's the utter aliveness of God. All deductions about, potentially bad this and potentially bad that, and first creation, second creation, all deductions from that are staging posts, as it were, that we can see usually as we leave them behind, as this part of being called into a life that is vastly more spacious and generous and kind and, detailed about ordinary things, and less dismissive and contemptuous of things that are than we are inclined to be usually in our religious and zealous passions, if that makes sense.
Perfect sense. And it leads me to the last part of the subtitle of your book, Original Sin Through Easter Eyes. So what does the resurrection have to do with what you're talking about? The aliveness of God.
Yeah, I think that that's exactly what Easter is. Easter is the opening up into our midst of that. Oh, I can't. So suddenly, Adam has gone. You've speeded up and become. Oh yeah. Okay, it's not just the coffee. Easter is the eruption into our midst of that utter aliveness. That's what it looks like. It's both there and astoundingly new, but also scarcely recognizable and having to draw us beyond ourselves. I think that's the mysterious sense we get of the resurrection narratives, of something that was there from before all time, now apparent to us as a victim who's no longer simply dead, who's dead and alive, who is full of forgiveness, and who's encouraging us to dare to be alive, to step out of an unforgiving world where we bind each other down rather than dare to trust each other on an adventure, and say, okay, we're going to hope that this whole thing called creation is a good adventure. It's got a purpose. It's meant to make us shine. The one who set it up is not out to get us, loves us, and is going to turn this into something bigger and better than we could imagine. That's
yes, without counting our sins against us, which I think is one of the stumbling blocks with this idea of original sin for many people is that, oh my God, it means that there's something wrong with me, and I have to, at the very core of who I am, there's some terrible flaw, and we all want to that's what we focus on. We don't want to think of ourselves as,
And the flip side of that is, yes, of course there is. And guess what? It doesn't matter.
That's the part we don't want to realize, that to God it doesn't matter. There is something in us that can be, what would you say, drawn out or made more.
Yeah, that's right. God sees potential where we see closed down, and I think that's the thing. So, and very often we prefer closed down because it seems safer, and I think that's that's another classic definition of original sin is resistance to being brought into being. And I think that in a sense that's the same thing as our access to creation is through being forgiven. I think that those are flip sides of the same thing.
I like that. I'm seeing connections in what you just said about being closed down in the scripture passage. We have a lot of preachers here in the scripture passages for this upcoming Sunday. I think it's Easter 2, and it's kind of the doubting Thomas story.
Oh, right, which is wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. Where the disciples are in a locked room, Jesus comes among them and blows the Holy Spirit upon them and says, forgive. If you forgive, people will be forgiven. If you don't forgive, there won't be forgiveness. So he's basically trying to get them to forgive. And then later, Thomas says, Thomas wasn't there, and he's like, oh, I doubt it. And then Jesus shows him his wounds. And it's such a great story, and I'm wondering if you can talk about it for a little bit.
Yeah, well, I don't know whether the gospel in your lectionary brings those two together, but that's 2 Sundays, isn't it? It's the first, it's last Sunday and next Sunday. I mean, not in the lectionary, but in the first appearance was on Easter Sunday evening, and the appearance to Thomas was a week later. And I think that, yeah, let's remember Thomas. I think that Thomas gets a bit of a rough ride. Remember, Thomas, as I think you mentioned before we started, was the one who, when it came to the resurrection of Lazarus, or when Lazarus was dead, says, but I think not in a gung ho, but in rather a despairing way. Well, then let's go off with him to die. In other words, that Thomas is, he basically he signed up to being a good soldier. And doesn't particularly mind where it ends, because he would rather go and follow Jesus even if it means going to death. But he's got no particular sense that it's actually going to mean something better and bigger than that. So he says, in what I take to be a kind of a grim voice. Oh well then let's go off and die with him. At least that's my reading of it. It's a sign of him not understanding, rather than a sign of him being an extremely loyal, chipper soldier. But anyhow, by the time we get to the morning of or the evening of the resurrection, the first point I want to make, and excuse me for boring you because you all know this anyhow, that the verb is enepiousesen, so to do with it's breathing in. He breathes into them. It's usually in our translations breathing upon them, but the reason I prefer to translate breathing in is because it's the same Septuagint verb as by which God breathes breath into Adam in the book of Genesis. God breathes the spirit, the breath of life into Adam in Genesis with exactly the same verb as Jesus breathes the spirit life into the new Adam, the new Adam from the new Adam into the disciples at that moment. So I think that again, the notion that we're talking about something that is an act of creation and how we find ourselves within creation is already there in the text. Now, as you say, Thomas doesn't get it the first time, and there's this strange diptych effect with the few days with Mary not touching, being told not to touch first, then the central appearance of Jesus, and then a week later, Thomas finally being told to touch. Thomas says he wants to touch on the, but he won't believe otherwise. And then finally, a week later, he gets to touch. But it's interesting that in order to see Jesus, first of all, he has to mirror him. I think it was Bob Hamilton Kelly who pointed that out to me. I can't remember. I think it was Bob Hamilton Kelly who said, imagine what it must have looked like physically for Jesus to show himself. It meant that Thomas had to stand, who was a twin. Anyhow, Thomas was a twin, so there was already a doubling going on there. So Thomas had to stand in front of Jesus and twin him, look to him exactly in the face, and trace things directly opposite himself, which is rather a wonderful sign. of what was going on. My sense is that what Jesus is saying at this point is, and this is one of the passages. This is one of the reasons why that text is so difficult. Is that there's an easy way to read the text, or rather, there's an obvious way to read the text, as though it were saying, well, I'm here, so you get to see me. You're the lucky one, and all the others will just have to put up with the witness borne by my dumb disciples and apostles hereafter, and that'll be awfully heroic of them to have believed without being able to see. But that, of course, is exactly not what the text says. The text says rather the reverse, that actually it's going to be much easier and it'd be a greater blessing for those of us who are not physically present at the time of the resurrection. And I suspect that is because it will be easier for us to understand that we are on the inside of who Jesus is. In other words, that he is not for us someone outside us any longer, but that we are now the bearers of his body in our bodies, and that we are the sharer of his identity. That is what him giving us his spirit means. And us, therefore, becoming the ark of the new covenant, the church that is his body, all of those things, that we are now him. That's the whole point. And in St. John's Gospel, that's exactly what he promised the disciples before the Passion. When the day will come when you will ask these things in my Father's name, you won't need to ask me. And why? Because I will be in you. You will be me. And I think that's the point. Our adoption as sons and daughters does actually not mean, well, there's a special little, what's the word? Chorale for Jesus in the middle, and everyone else is sort of second-rate sons, adopted sons and daughters around. He says, no, there's no chorale at all. There is only one son, and we are it. So it's literally a question of you'll be more blessed because you will be me. You won't see me, you will be me. And that's that I take it is why Jesus is not giving Thomas a sop, or not giving everyone else a sop for what he gave to Thomas, but saying to Thomas, listen, yeah, you're a pretty literal-minded fellow. Now you're going to twin me here, and now you've got to be me. It's probably going to be easier to be me if you haven't got me in front of you.
That's great.
Yeah.
Adam and you and I talked about this question before the call with James, but I do kind of want to go back to that being forgiven is prior to being created, and ask this. There's this sense in which, so there's something we need to be forgiven for, right? So that somehow all of humanity shares in. Is that what we're talking about here with original sin? And then what is this thing that we need to be forgiven for?
Forgiven from, loosed from. Yeah, I think from our our involvement, which is the involvement of all of us, and which is personal because all of us are formed in the same way, in a structure, that which we call human culture, which is run by death and its fear. Now, when you say forgiven for, that makes it sound as though you're saying, oh, this is something which each of us did. Each of us made some personal mistake at the beginning of time, or outside ourselves. This is clearly nonsense. No, each of us is found to be becoming a person at all in the midst of a culture in which we are already from within tied up into a natural tendency, or what seems to be a natural tendency, to respond, for instance, to aggression aggressively, to enter into competition, to enter into rivalry, to survive at the expense of others, and so on and so forth. We don't know how to be called into being humans in any other way. So there's automatically a strange mixture of good, bad, insufficient, and damaging, which is just what we are when we start. Now, what enables us to discover this is our being let go from it.
Yeah.
Say, oh, so I can see now that there really is a me that's being called into being, and that it was really a good thing that I was born. And yes, that I have been caught up in things that diminished me. And of course I didn't start them, but the fact is that I wouldn't be who I am at all without them. So there's only one way for me to be, separated from them, which is for me to be unhooked from my personal involvement in them. It's not as though, in the case of any of us, let's say, the possibilities of revenge or forgiveness are neutral possibilities, so that given a choice for how to behave in reciprocal action, we can say, shall I be vengeful or shall I be forgiving? For most of us, revenge is vastly easier than forgiveness. Lashing back is vastly easier than forgiveness. Reciprocal tit for tat, it's the easiest thing to do. Why? It's how, that's how we are. That's how we find ourselves to be. Now, all of that suggests that forgiveness is something that requires learning and undoing of something that seems to be natural to me. And I think that's, to my mind, in a sense, that's common sense. It's not as though any of us is able to stand outside that formation and make a neutral choice to take part in either destruction or forgiveness. We find ourselves as people who are, if you like, constituted by a tendency to behave in certain ways, and for whom our being created involves our being separated from that tendency, which involves us being unhooked from our personal involvement in it, or our being forgiven. Unhooked from personal involvement in equals forgiven. Does that make sense? I know it's difficult to understand because so many of us want the notion of forgiveness to correspond to, neutral decisions that one made with one's best judgment. I would say no, long before we get to have a judgment at all, who we are and how we hold on to being human is constituted in painful and destructive ways of being, which are not intrinsic to us. And that's the key point.
Yeah. Yes, that's the thing that I would love to talk to you some more about. So not intrinsic means what? Not inevitable or not necessary?
Yes, that's right. If it was something that was intrinsic to us, then really we'd be saying, well, there's nothing to be forgiven because this is just what they are.
Yeah, well, sure, right.
If you're saying it's something which looks as though it's intrinsic to us, but we have discovered that actually it was accidental to us, then we say, oh, in which case the difference between the inevitable and the potential is forgiveness. Which is why the doctrine of forgiveness is so important, because it takes us out of, how would you say, fatalism.
Yes.
I'm so glad that you're bringing this up, because that's one of the main critiques that you see against mimetic theory, is that it brings this ontology of violence to it. And so we are, in order to have human culture, we are necessarily violent. But you wouldn't say that mimetic theory has an ontology of violence.
Absolutely not. No, I think that I don't think that it has an ontology of anything. I don't think that it's really into ontology. If it has an ontology of anything, it's an ontology of desire, which is in principle a good thing. But no, you're exactly right. The ability to be honest about our violence, it seems to me, is only made bearable if we can imagine it as something which is forgivable. What I notice is that the people who criticize mimetic theory for having an ontology of violence usually want to escape from the awfulness of the view of humanity which they attribute to Girard, which is a very dark view. They want to escape from it by postulating some good bit that one can hold on to so that we can be potentially good. And I want to say that's just as much a piece of crazy romanticism as anything else. If you're stuck with that, hey, the whole point of us knowing ourselves forgiven is that it enables us to look our darkness in the face and not be dominated by it. So, that's. I think that I understand that. Yes, Girard's view of who we are is pretty dark, and we usually glimpse that darkness in other people's violence and desperately try to avoid looking at it in ourselves. And what Girard is saying is no. The same darkness that you can perceive very easily in other people is your darkness. And the whole point of what has enabled us to see it is that we are in the process of being forgiven, or at least that's my theologian's thing.
Yeah.
It's only grace, if you like, that enables us not to be utterly crushed by the knowledge of who we are, what we're involved in, the thinking that humanity is such a completely failed project that really, we might as well hand it over to the cockroaches who are going to do a better job than we.
Right. James, I want to question from the in the chat room. Tim asked this a little while ago, but I think it kind of relates at this point. He's talking about this idea of anonymous Christians, which I'm not exactly sure what that is, but he asked, did the resurrection change anything for those not even indirectly in contact with Jesus? So did the resurrection do anything for those who didn't know Christ at the time?
Oh, at the time, or in general?
Forever, I guess, yeah.
Forever, yeah. Yes, no, I think it did. I think that one of the Eucharistic prayers that we pray is that Jesus, went to his death and revealed the resurrection. I think that part of what Jesus was about was making available to us humans something that is simply true and always was from before the foundation of the world about who we as humans are. The interesting thing about objective truth is that it doesn't particularly matter how confused people are about it. It's still true. So, and this is a benign truth. This is not a gotcha truth that now you must get it. We take it for granted that if Jesus did this, it was so as to open up to all people the possibility of coming to know the love of the Father for all of us as humans. That was what it was about. It wasn't, I'm doing this so as to create a little sect. Now, how different people have access to this truth, how different people find themselves able, for instance, under particular circumstances, to give their lives carelessly away because of they see a need for to do some form of justice for someone who's suffering. As if you like, the explicit nature of that is not ours to is not ours to judge. But the notion that something real about what it is to be human and what it is to be bound down by death was undone by Jesus at his resurrection, and that therefore that pattern, what we would call the form of grace, is now available anywhere to anybody at all, whether or not they put a name to it. That seems to me obvious. Now, that doesn't mean to say that it's easy to understand, and I'd have thought that one of the whole points of having the stories of Jesus and the image of the Passion is that it sets it out very, very clearly. What is this to do with? This is to do with overcoming a lynch death and showing that it is possible to live in these sort of circumstances. And guess what? God is on the side of the victim, and everyone who thought they were right was wrong, and everyone who thought they were wrong were right. In other words, the story is acted out there in the most devastatingly unreligious way, if you like, which is why it's a critique of being human, not of this religion or that religion. This religion or that religion is comparatively irrelevant.
Yeah.
If not harmful, but comparatively irrelevant, because the key thing is being able to share the space that Jesus opened up for us of not being run by death, so as to be able to share in his life.
Absolutely.
Great.
I love it.
Bob Hall has a comment about humility. He says, "It occurs to me that humility is buckler and shield against the vagaries of existence. It alone allows us to learn and grow from things that happen." Do you have any comments about humility and that, James?
Yes. Well, first of all, I'd like to tell you how one of my recent pleasures was meeting Archbishop Tutu, who always prefaces his remarks by saying, "I am a very modest man, and I'm very proud of my modesty," which always seemed to me to be a lovely self-deprecating, lovely self-deprecating start. But no, I think that he's absolutely right. Humility, coming from humus, not chickpea sauce, but earth, is precisely the quality of being aware of our earthliness, and therefore of our being loved slowly, gently, through real creative acts in little step-by-step ways as humans. And that this is how we find our way into reality and truth. We are not angels who are supposed to abstract from human conditions so as to rush into some spiritual realm. That's what angels do. We are flesh, and the flesh is a blessing. It's a condition of possibility of our enjoyment of God, and it's a very special enjoyment of God. It's an enjoyment of God that is going to encourage, envy in the angels. I like to think of that, the image which I have for that is imagining Jussi Björling, who's my favorite opera singer, a wonderful Swedish tenor who died in about 1960 or 61. Imagining him singing in heaven, and all the angels desperately poking around in his throat and his vocal cords, because of course they can do that without interrupting, singing, trying to work out how it is that this piece of flesh comes up with this miraculous sound, that a single human voice is able to emit tones and harmonies such as angels could never come up with. And the answer is, it's because it's a human being, and it's trained muscles, and it's time and practice and skill, starting with being a human being. And this is something which gives glory to God, such that the angels are doing cartwheels over themselves trying to understand how it's done. So yes, I think that humility is that sense of sticking close to the earth and being glad that it's a damn good job.
I'm going to bring JC into the chat because he has a fairly lengthy comment, and he'll do it better than I will. But as JC, click on your cam button and we'll bring you in up at the top. As JC is doing that, Suella makes a briefer comment about going back to Thomas, about Thomas reaching into the side ribs of Jesus and asking if this is another creation image, and what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I entirely agree. I think that it's the covenant. It's the covenant with Adam and Eve being gone back to, as it were, because the side, the wound in the side, is us being able to return into into Earthling before Earthling was separated from into Adam and Eve. So yes, I think that, which is one of the reasons why there is no longer slave nor free. Jew nor Greek, man and woman. It doesn't say man or woman. It says man and woman in Christ. It's very interesting. That's very often misquoted, that phrase, by St. Paul. But I think that's the point. Yes, I think that's exactly right. That we're now enabled to get back into the before all covenants began. If the Ur covenant was God taking a piece out of Earthling, passing through it, putting Earthling into a deep sleep, and then saying, "This is flesh of my flesh," we're now being taken back into being Earthling, into being God's intended enjoyment. So yes, I think that covenantal language is very much present by hint in the Thomas scene.
Creation images are run throughout resurrection stories. I mean, you have got the first image is in a garden.
Yep.
So I mean, it's just all there, and that's one of the things that you highlight so much in your work is how the resurrection is connected to creation, and I love it. JC, go ahead and how are you doing today, JC?
I'm doing pretty good. It's only 9:49 in the morning. So
I know. Good morning to you. We can hear you perfectly. So if you want to go ahead and make your comment or question.
And you have a spectacular mullet of some sort going on the top of your head.
I know. Well, my wife already left the house, so I had not been checked. Usually, though, since I stand so tall, people don't see my head. Your book, it was one of the books that really, changed along with Mark Heim's book. And honestly, having to read Jacques Lacan a long time ago, right when I got to page 28, things really resonated with me. And I'm just going to read my question first because I'm a preacher and I can keep going. You stated something I know so well, that people with autism prove the mimetic creation of self, in quotes, as someone who works with the lens of theology of disability, me. I believe that this reality is essential to know and actually find those with developmental delays, especially communication, actually shed light on what is inherently spiritual or divine in humanity. That is not part of society or culture. The question is, how can we balance socializing those with different abilities while also allowing the social other to learn from those with disabilities without making them an object lesson? Just an example for my son, he hugs when he's upset and he hugs when he is happy with you. So he inherently seems to understand that you're supposed to be perfect like the Heavenly Father is perfect and reign on the righteous and unrighteous. And since I'm in Seattle, there is no such thing as sun on the righteous and unrighteous.
He makes his coffee falls upon the righteous and the unrighteous.
And coffee is just water is what we call coffee. So.
Yeah, no, I think that is a beautiful question, and I think it's not only true with autism or autism's spectrum issues, but I read a fascinating paper recently by a transgendered woman who's gone into very considerable detail about the patterns of but in the first 2 to 3 years of learning that form what we would now call a transgender identity, which are precisely the relationship between certain forms of push for identity and certain forms of socialization. And she very much is following Girard's understanding of how the self is constituted, but bringing a lot of very contemporary research on those issues. And one of her points is precisely that the interesting thing is that it's easier to spot objective markers in processes that seem variant from what we regard as normal. And those actually set what we call normal free to be much more aware of how, let's say, how contingent they are. And I mean, one of her points is it becomes from the transgender experience enables what she calls sexual variant minority to become much clearer, as well as the sexual majority model to become much clearer. In other words, we're looking at processes of development that have worked in different ways in different times. In other words, looking at the nitty-gritty of how we actually do get formed as human beings in those first years. So I can see how autism or Asperger's autism spectrum could deal with brings up exactly the same issues. What are the ways in which different forms of humanity are actually developing? And how much more, if you like, freedom and responsibility of us there is in them rather than them being fatalities than we had thought. So obviously I've got no technical answer to your question, but I do really want to affirm that direction because I think that it's applicable not only in this sphere but in other spheres as well.
I have to say that working with the transgender community is actually what brought me into working with disabilities. Just it was a natural progression, and then I happen to have a son with a disability too, which I don't think is providence. I hear it that it is all the time, but that's just others projecting their theology. But I really appreciate because they do seem to free up an understanding of how mimetics works, because it doesn't work all the time.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And we see, yeah, that's right. And they free the normal from being the normative.
Right.
And I think that's hugely important.
That's great.
That seems to me to be part of the joy of being wrong. Hey, we're all screwed up. Being screwed up is not the problem. It's where we go from here. That's what's interesting.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, JC.
Thank you.
Incidentally,
James,
can I just say, I'd love, if anybody's interested, I'd love to post you the link to that to the article by Susan Grinder on the gender issue. If anybody wants to have a look at that, because it's so interesting to see. It's one of the very few places I've seen anybody bring mimetic questions into link with a study of transgender issues.
Oh yeah.
We will definitely post that up on the video. That would be great.
I'll send the link to you both afterwards.
Thank you, James.
I know that we're running down on time, so I just want to kind of wrap things up. Everybody is saying beautiful conversation, wonderful. So thank you so much for being with us, James.
My pleasure.
It's been a pleasure talking with you about the joy of being wrong, and I feel things loosening up for me as we're talking through it. And thank you.
Good, wonderful. Well, talk again soon. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you.
I look forward to it. Thank you, James.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Suzanne, I just want to say that was a whole lot of fun with James.
Yes, it was. He talks about holding on to ideals loosely and lightly, and not getting tied down and getting doctrine right and theologies right. And when I talk with him, I do, like you, feel that, oh, okay, I guess that thing about original sin's a little more fun to play with than I thought. I could be a little free and loose with it. And so, yeah, he just has this way of relaxing us about getting things right all the time. And it is a joy. It's a joy to talk with him.
Well, I mean, the best part about it for me is that the joy of being wrong is that, you get caught up in these, mimetic theory is a great way of helping us understand how we get caught up in mechanisms of violence, scapegoating. And as I was listening to him, there were parts where I started thinking, well, you can start scapegoating even the mechanism of scapegoating. And he talks about how it actually forms us into being who we are, but that's not the last step. The step beyond that is being created into the image of God, right? I mean, yeah. And even when you get caught up in those mechanisms, you are loved.
Absolutely.
Even when you're wrong, you are loved. And one of the great things about the transformative things about that for me is there was one point where he was talking about, Renee says, it's always easy to see the scapegoaters out there, but not the scapegoater inside. And so when you see scapegoating out there, it's just a great reminder to say, you know what? They're loved by God too, just like I'm loved by God. And that just changes everything.
Yes. And the whole idea that our sense of self, is a contingent project. It's not, that's what mimetic theory does, I think, for this understanding of creation, is that we are always in the process of becoming something. And it's not like we got created and there's an I that's inside of me and it's done. And now I just go through the world and interact with people. No, the I is always contingent and coming and evolving and changing and being brought into being, and that's where God is still, creation is still an ongoing thing, even for you and me and everyone who thinks we're finished projects.
Right.
Fun.
I love it. It's awesome. All right. Well, thank you all very much for being with us, and we will keep you updated on what we're up to in the future. And so, yeah, until then, peace be with you, friends.
Bye, everybody.